Radyo, 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 katipunan. Radyo, katipunan. Radyo, katipunan. Radyo, 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 katipunan. Radyo, 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 katipunan. Voice of the Blue Eagle, kami di mapipigil sa pagbabalitang tumpak at tama. Buhay at tenista, sa loob sa labas ng eskwela, ating ibibida lahat ng kwela. Radyo, 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 katipunan. Radyo, 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 katipunan. Radyo, radyo, katipunan. Radyo, katipunan. Kawal ni Ignacio, katipunero sugod, todo sa kayod, dunong at tulog. Lipat na Blue Eagle, galing giting nagigil. Blue and white, one big fight. Radyo, 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 katipunan. Radyo, 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 katipunan. Radyo, katipunan. Radyo, katipunan. Radyo, 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 katipunan. Radyo, katipunan.
Radyo, 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 katipunan. Radyo, katipunan. Radyo, katipunan. Radyo, 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 katipunan. Radyo, 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 katipunan. Voice of the Blue Eagle, kami di mapipigil sa pagbabalitang tumpak at tama. Buhay at tenista, sa loob sa labas ng eskwela, ating ibibida lahat ng kwela. Radyo, 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 katipunan. Radyo, 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 katipunan. Radyo, katipunan. Radyo, katipunan. Kawal ni Ignacio, katipunero sugod, todo sa kayod, tunong at tulong. Lipat na Blue Eagle, galing giting at tigil. Blue and white, one big fight. Radyo, 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 katipunan. Radyo, 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 katipunan. Radyo, katipunan. Radyo, katipunan.
It's time to level up! Your talk variety program showcasing the best in media and other fields. As we feature the most loved personalities and the best practices of what we truly refer to as Magis. Together with multi-awarded multimedia guru Mr. Noel Ferrer, let's all level up every Friday from 3 to 6 p.m. here on Radyo Katipunan 87.9 FM.
Level up.
All good, all ready, all the best. We're now here in Bohol, waiting for the grand rally of the Lenny Kiko tandem. But for Level Up, here on Radyo Katipunan, we shall be featuring a very special forum with the most esteemed political analysts and professors from the different universities, top universities, not only here in the Philippines but abroad, organized by the Georgetown Club of the Philippines. Thank you very much for this very, very informative forum that you may be able to guide and discern and then convert people based on a lot of insights and different points of views. And then we be able to see through the scenarios that will be posed to us in the next 38 days before the national elections. So, sana marami tayong matutunan dito and in turn be able to echo and educate our fellow men, our kababayans, in preparation for the 2022 election. So it's aptly entitled, What's at Stake? The Philippine 2022 Elections and Beyond. So here's a very special feature now here on Level Up on Radyo Katipunan.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Quintin Pastrana. I'm the president of the Georgetown Club of the Philippines, and I would like to warmly welcome you on behalf of our partners to this critical forum, What's at Stake for the Philippines 2022 and Beyond. This is a watershed election, and what's critical for us today is to find out exactly, stripped of all the candidates, what is important for the next administration to face in light of the challenges accumulated over the last several administrations. This is an ongoing struggle for current administration, but at the same time, a new set of challenges given this VUCA environment for how the next leader, her cabinet or his cabinet, is going to be working together to embrace these challenges and to help the Philippines be resilient and transcend these opportunities into a new country and a new international order. So I really welcome you to this forum. Please feel free to ask your questions, raise your concerns with the panelists who are representing different persuasions, and will look at these challenges from an economic, sociological, political, and security lens. So I invite you again to enjoy the forum, embrace the issues, talk to the panelists, and it will be something that aligns with our Jesuit values on behalf of our club of contemplation and action, reasoning with the position, and more importantly, ad maiorem Dei gloriam, in que hominum salutem, which is something outside yourself for the greater glory of God, for the service of humankind. Maraming salamat po. Hoy Saksa.
Again, our program for today, as I was made to appreciate it, is we invited 4 distinguished guests to speak with us. We're giving them 5 to 10 minutes, up to 10 minutes each, to tackle the question, as Quintin and Tony have laid down for us. Agnostic to whomever might win in the coming elections, what kind of country, what state of government, what problems and issues will the next government be inheriting? What are the things, in other words, that our country will have to tackle regardless of who becomes our next leaders? So we'd like to invite, I know your time is very, very precious, and I know you're also pressed for time. So we want to start off with Dr. Clarita Carlos. And then afterwards, after hearing from all of our speakers, we'll have some time, about 30 to 40 minutes, to have a little discussion with them as well. If you're tuning in via Facebook or right here in Zoom, you can leave your questions in the comment section. We'll try to get your comments as well. Now let's start off. Dr. Carlos, if you're ready. Is Dr. Carlos ready? She's still here online. We seem to be having technical difficulties all around. Could I invite any of our speakers, July, Dr. Ron, Nicole, if anybody's ready to start us off?
Hi, Robbie. I can go ahead if you want.
Okay, maraming salamat,
Okay, so,
Ron. Sorry, ito na si Dr. Carlos. Sorry about that. Dr. Carlos?
yeah, I cannot switch on my video because the host is, canceling my video.
Okay. Well,
What are you
can we
guys
ask the
doing?
organizers please to turn on the camera for Dr. Carlos?
Please try again, Dr. Carlos. It should be on right now.
Yeah, I don't care really if there's no video. It doesn't matter so long as you hear me, you guys. Can you hear me now?
Loud and clear.
Yes.
Okay. I understand I have only 10 minutes tops to discuss with you what should have been discussed for like 10 years. So let me truncate my thoughts in regard to what is at stake on May 9 in this election. And I have listed down four of them, major ones. And if I can stay on for the Q&A because I'm running to another activity, um, I will respond to questions. Otherwise, I will disappear after I have presented. So the first thing that you will notice about what is going on and the chaos that we have witnessed is a very, very broken political party system. You know, the vetting for who is going to run where is happening outside the purview of the political parties, so that somebody can just declare himself, herself independent, and the political parties are split into various splinter groups, each one, you know, presenting his or her candidates. So the vetting procedure is so compromised, so that even the public, you know, the 66 million qualified voters, really at sea in regards to, you know, which political party one candidate belongs to, and to what extent it is important for them when they cast their votes on May 9. The other part about a broken political party in terms of its implication is that, you know, whatever promises a candidate makes, if he does not have the political party behind him, I really don't know who's going to realize all these promises. They're just empty, they're just saliva, you know, because you need the support from the two chambers in Congress to be able to realize what you want to do. So unless, of course, you are assuming that if you're independent, or if you're coming from a very small party, that, you know, suddenly the 300 or so people in the lower chamber and the majority of the 24 will suddenly cotton on to what you want to do. And that is, in fact, a very, very dangerous assumption. So earlier, Tony Abad talked about systemic challenges. I think one of the challenges that needs to be addressed quickly by the next president of the republic would be to change our structure. And I will not go into the nitty-gritty of the need for constitutional reform, but yes, we need to reform our basic law, because the 1987 Constitution is basically an anti-Marcos Constitution, a very verbose Constitution, no? Pinakamadaldal na Constitution, sobrang haba. Things which should not be there, they are there, you know. And of course, it's a carryover from what we copied from the United States of America, 1935, 73, then 87. And many of the things that we copied should not be copied, like the Senate. But, you know, I'll not go there now. Then the second, so broken political party system, something we should not have anymore in the next round of elections. And the quick answer would be to shift to a parliamentary system where the political party will be so pivotal to the life of, to our political life. So that, you know, the campaign period is coming out of our ears. I don't know how much longer we can endure this. While in a parliamentary system, you have only like 10, 12 days for the campaign period, because one is only running for the electoral district and not, you know, running, going over the whole archipelago. And then, of course, you will not have cases where suddenly somebody loses his party, changes his political color, because in a parliamentary system, that will be equivalent to political suicide. So let's set aside the broken political party system, and then we go to the legitimacy of the election. I think I'm 75 years old, and this is about the most, how would I call it, hostile, verbally abusive, cruel, unkind election campaign that I have witnessed thus far in my 75 years of life on earth. Maybe because it is exacerbated by the social media, which is ever present. You know, you wake up in the morning, the first thing that you look into is your equipment and find out how many have liked you and not liked you. And the burst of activity in the social media is just both tremendously positive and tremendously evil. And that's something that may link to the outcome of the May 9 elections, because if people are not ready, like in any liberal democratic framework, to accept the election results, because there is a question about the integrity of the election process itself, then I can't imagine what we shall witness. And I have some fairly sinister scenarios in my mind. So if the legitimacy of the one who's going to be elected, whoever he or she may be, on May 9 is questioned, Legitimacy means just acceptance. It's not legality, it's legitimacy. It comes from the section in the Constitution that says that sovereignty resides in the people and every government authority comes from the people. So if the people feel, or the public feels, that in fact their vote has been compromised, that the integrity of this COMELEC is also seriously compromised, then we have a problem. So, and then the next chief executive, the chief architect of our foreign policy, will have to be confronted by a very complicated geopolitical configuration right now. I teach a course in geopolitics in the graduate school, and many people think it is something, arcane, just for people like us who are teaching the course, but this is everybody's concern. This is everybody's concern. We are still linked to the United States of America because the Mutual Defense Treaty of 1952 is still in force, and therefore we're still a defense ally of the US. So when the US wants the Quad, Australia, US, Japan, India, to become a collective security alliance, how will the chief executive, the chief architect of our foreign policy decide? Vladimir Putin has been asking the Philippines for several years now to train and exercise with our military and wants a status of forces agreement with us. How are we going to respond to that? Especially since I saw some news that he is going to visit our country soon. How soon? Maybe before the Duterte disappears, or maybe when a new administration comes about in July 2022. How are we going to deal with China, who is our neighbor? China, which has declared the South China Sea as its own sphere of influence, that it owns the whole China Sea, and we're one of the six, claiming that we own part of it. How are you going to deal with Europe in ascendance or descendants, depending on how you look at it? And how are you going to deal with all the concomitants of the ongoing Ukraine-Russia crisis, which more likely might not just be finished on July 1, 2022? So for me, you must have a Machiavellian, strategic thinker, wily person who would make the most judicious choices on July 1, starting July 1. You must have somebody who has a national strategy, who does not have a list of things just to promise, and they cannot be crocheted together, because a national strategy will contain all the milestones, all manner of means to put together the human and non-human resources of our country to bring about certain goals. If we only have a grocery list of things that you promised, that is not a national strategy. I don't know what to call it. It's a list. So a national strategy will tell us how to deal with India, how to deal with China, how to deal with the Quad, how to deal with Japan wanting to have nuclear warheads in Japan, and the like. You cannot have an intellectually vacuous chief architect of our foreign policy on July 1, 2022. I think I should end there. Thank you.
Maraming salamat po, Dr. Carlos. And as you mentioned, we know you're running off somewhere. So I do just want to squeeze in one quick question, just in case we lose you for later on. But just on the first 2 points that you mentioned, the weak party system, as well as the structural things that we have to do with government, I would suspect, unfortunately, a lot of these are self-perpetuating, and it's also a lot of it feeds into each other. So where do you break the cycle?
You break the cycle by structural reforms. There are two ways to change society. Either I change you, and it will take 3 generations to change you, your values, your orientation, and the like. That's empirically grounded. But you want us to short-circuit the process, change the structures within which the individual behaves, is made to operate. That means constitutional reforms. you change it to a parliamentary system, you will not have the things that I have already noted. People, change their political color depending on what they want, and they never, never get punished. As a matter of fact, they earn more. Mas guapo pa sila. They earn more points. This will not happen in a parliamentary system. And for God's sakes, are you not tired with this campaign? Ang lalim naman ng salapi ng mga tao na to. Ang tagal-tagal na ng kampanya na to. Samantalang in a parliamentary system, you will only have 10, 12 days to do it because you're just running as an MP, as a member of parliament in an electoral district. And wala kang notion ng term limits kasi, you can be 100 years old there for as long as you were elected as an MP by your district. And you won't even have, the notion of political dynasties would be irrelevant kasi if you're competent and I just happen to have your surname also, what's the point, for so long as you're elected by your electoral district. And your chancellor, your prime minister, he or she will continue to be there for as long as he has the majority of the in the House. Diba? So even the tenure, political tenure, we're talking about continuity after 2,000 days, iibahin na naman yung ating disenyo ng buhay natin. Why are we doing that? No? Let's not do that anymore. No? By the way, the Republic is as old as I am. I'm 75, the Republic is also 75. Isang pa ako nasa libingan na malapit na akong mamatay. Yung Republic natin, nagtatanong pa kung sino siya. Teenager di ba?
But you mentioned the political, you mentioned the political dynasties and the vested interests of the people there. We start off with precisely this discussion of how do you effect any kind of reform when the people, it's going to be a given. The people to whom we will want to push this reform are people with disincentives for change. We ask this every time we talk about land reform. We ask this every time we talk about anything that will change. You mentioned that the parliamentary system might finally make the political dynasties meaningless. But to that point, even if that were true, wouldn't a parliamentary system essentially be behaving like the supermajority that we have now in Congress? But the more basic point is the next government, whoever it is, and all the governments we've seen, how do they push reform in a Congress, in Parliament, that is against reform?
Well, with great difficulty, but it can be done. Kung gusto mo, di mega magagawa kang paraan. So sell it. Since, I don't know how long ago, 1990, kami nila Pepe Abueva and Pimentel, we've been going around the archipelago doing political education, parliamentary system, like that. But the beauty of democracy, of our democracy, is that majority rules, which means that, what is the philosophical underpinning of majority rule? You don't vote to harm yourself, isn't it? You vote to benefit yourself. Then sell the parliamentary system in terms of wala na kayong term limits. You can be elected, on and on and on for as long as your electoral district elects you. And then if you are, if you want to be a chancellor or a prime minister, you can continue to be elected as a chancellor and a prime minister for as long as you control the majority of the House in terms of, a political party or a coalition thereof. But at the same time, you can be kicked out with a vote of non-confidence. We don't have to go through the torturous impeachment procedure. People keep on saying, Dr. Carlos, magagawa ba yan? Yeah, magagawa. Bakit hindi? Kasi watak-watak ang political party. Kanya nga Sasabihin mo sa political party, watak-watak ka. Tignan ko nga kung makakasurvive ka sa parliamentary system.
Okay.
Talagang you will get a vote of non-confidence. Lalo na kung bobo ka, hindi ka makakasurvive doon sa question hour pa lang kailangan yung datos mo nasa fingertips mo. Have you seen Theresa May when she was defending Brexit? Wow, bilib talaga ako sa kanya. I mean, and of course, Theresa May did not suddenly come from the kawayan and became premier of Great Britain. She was honed by the Conservative Party, as Tony Blair was honed by the Conservative Party when he was, I don't know, I think he was 16 or 17. Di pwedeng galing lang sa kawayan, hindi nga naging maghabol ng aso sa sa barangay. Bigla na lang bumulusok na lang sa national realm. And tayo yung magsasuffer sa kabubuhan ng tao. There are many, many things really that can be done. And concomitant with the parliamentary system, ayusin mo yung electoral reform. The time is not enough to discuss with you the party list na mali. Unfortunately, I have appeared there, alam ni Ronald dito, 10,000 times yan sa tinamaan ng committee hearing na yan. Wala namang nakinig sa akin kung ano ibig sabihin ng party list. Ayan ngayon. Diba? Yan ang nakikita nyo ngayon. Total, sinayang nyo lang yung panahon kung nagpipresent sa inyo. Daming
Okay.
bagay, di ba? Pero
Mm.
underpinning nito, structural reform talaga. Otherwise, mamamatay ako pareho pa rin ng Pilipinas. Di ba?
Well,
Sayang naman. Sayang.
Apa. Well, Dr. Carlos, as you said, you have very limited time. We'd like to thank you. We'd be happy to have you for as long as you can stay. But we will have the other speakers now. Maraming salamat po. And speaking of the other great difficulties that we still have to face to move forward on many of these things, let me bring in our other speakers. Ron Mendoza, you were raising
Thank you
your
for
hand.
inviting me. Thank you.
Papa, maraming salamat po. The program actually has Dr. Tihangi ahead of you, but since Ron was kind enough to be willing to volunteer kanina, we might as well follow what we had started on. Ron, please, your take on the challenges for the next administration.
Thank you very much, Robbie. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I have a short presentation I want to share here. Is it visible now? There.
Yeah,
Can you
it's
see it?
loading.
Okay.
Yeah, we see it now. Thank you.
First of all, I want to thank Prof. Clarita for joining us. I had a hand in inviting her, and Prof. Clarita has been helping us in Ateneo School of Government over my deanship term, getting a few PhDs graduated, and I'm very thankful for her for all that help and also for joining us today. I'd like to actually leverage some of her ideas that she shared in my presentation. I share a lot of her angst, actually, the lack of reform that we're seeing. But I also see Robbie's really sharp questions, and I hope I can answer a little bit some of them in my presentation. First, my thesis is that if you want to describe the challenges of the next administration, it is the challenges of all the post-EDSA presidents, and it is the persistence of inequality in our country. We've managed to reduce poverty, but we have not managed to reduce inequality in the country, and inequality reflects itself in a number of ways in the Philippines and maybe in other countries too. First is through weak upward mobility. Gustong umangat ng mga Pilipino pero ang hirap magkaroon ng mas maayos na trabaho, decent jobs in the country. And for most of us in the middle class, the way out of low income or even poverty is really to just migrate first to the cities, which are fast growing and have the few decent jobs, and then abroad. If you become an OFW, which I was for a while, by the way. It's 15 years abroad until I returned to AIM to teach. Second is political concentration of power. You want to change that weak upward mobility, but the people holding power, as Robbie mentioned, are the main ones benefiting from the status quo. So there is sort of a big conflict of interest. Why would they change in a significant way the status quo when they're the main beneficiaries of this, not just in the political realm, by the way, but also in the economic realm? If I had more time, I would have shared with you some of the information on this, but let me just state that as something most of us do understand about our country, that you compete in politics because you protect your economic interests or you secure the ability to control rent, which you then dispense to your allies, to your cronies. And finally, economic concentration. There is rent because there is lack of openness. There are many protected, over-regulated sectors. And because of these constraints, you are able to then transform that into rent and parcel that out to all your allies, all your cronies. So I'm just going to go through all these three forms of inequality, which I will argue are actually self-reinforcing. It's a trap. The weak upward mobility is difficult to change because of the political concentration. The political concentration is difficult to change because, in the economic space, you're actually investing in power being perpetuated, and so on and so forth. So that's really the essence of my thesis, that inequality is really what we're after. And the entire 30 years post-EDSA, we've had really good progress in many fronts. We should be clear about where we progressed. In terms of resuscitating our economic institutions, our central bank, our Department of Finance, our budget, credit ratings upgrade, fastest growing economy before the pandemic. And if we manage to get out of this pandemic, I'm sure much of those will also contribute to our fast rebound again. But what we have not been able to reduce are these three main forms of inequality. So I'm just going to go through this very, very quickly. This is our income description for the Philippines. It just shows how unequal our country is. From the top households who are only numbering about 500,000, and even among those households, by the way, there's a lot of inequality. Monthly income of 131,000 already makes you be considered for the top 500,000 households in the Philippines. And we all know that 131,000 a month is not the monthly income of many Filipinos in the top strata. And if you go to the bottom, there's 2.9 million households who are poor, who are still poor. We're managing to reduce this before the pandemic, but the pandemic itself caused many to slide back into poverty, which is the other form of inequality. Some of us adapt better to shocks. Some of us just slide into poverty and low income again. Why? Because of healthcare expenditures, because someone lost a job in the family. And those types of institutions need to be built, those risk management institutions that are present in other countries, that they have strong and inclusive social protection and safety net systems. We don't have that yet, which is why so many in the middle class, the newly emancipated poor, are actually facing a lot of vulnerability and a lot of uncertainty. And maybe that is what is driving them towards sort of populist tendencies. They want to hear from strong leaders who will fix things and make things fair. At least this is my thesis for that very vulnerable and now very, very politically active middle class. The guru here is Dinjalai Tihanki, so I won't spend too much time explaining that behavior, but let's prod him a little bit when he presents. This is the story that I'm telling you from an economic lens. A lot of Filipinos fell into poverty during the pandemic, virtually wiping out the gains between 2015 and 2018, the fast growth period that, during some quarters, we were the fastest growing Asian economy, if you recall this. This was almost all wiped out by the pandemic, not because of coronavirus per se, but because of the mismanagement and the bad governance and the high uncertainty that we faced, the inability to balance health and economic targets simultaneously. This is what did us in, and this is why we have an additional 3.6 million Filipino households added into poverty yet again, after we painstakingly reduced that by 4.1 million between 2015 and 2018. So that's basically the story of our low income middle class, that they are not technically poor, but they don't necessarily feel unpoor nor empowered. They just slide back into poverty because of these types of shocks. Now, political concentration, I guess one would expect me to elaborate a little bit on dynasties. This is what we do research on, and I thank Professor Clarita Carlos and Dean July Nicole for the many collaborations in different events, different Senate hearings, basically supporting each other on the key reforms we all agreed to. One of them has to do with increasing competition in our political space. How do you do this? By actually trying to reform and regulate the presence of dynasties in our leadership. Now, Professor Clarita Carlos is correct that if you have good competitive framework for leadership selection, you may not need dynasty regulation anymore. But in our case, in the Philippines, I have to believe that without dynasty regulation in the present status quo that we have, it's very, very difficult to imagine things changing. Why? Because dynastic concentration, the existence of fat dynasties, yung nagsasabay-sabay, they run simultaneously for power, actually erodes one of the key elements of our democracy, which is checks and balances, especially at the local level. And if you're going to turn over all reforms in a decentralized framework, in a mandanas ruling, in a universal healthcare law that will actually decentralize some of these powers, all of these things, even in a federal setup, by the way, if we manage to push that kind of deep reform, we will be turning them over to these powerful clans unless you actually reform, regulate their ability to concentrate power in that new setup, and certainly in this existing setup that we have. What does it look like? And this is the famous slide that I presented in several Senate testimonies. 80% of governors, 67% of congressmen, and over half of mayors are coming from fat dynastic clans, meaning 2 family members and above in each clan are actually in elected office. And so therefore, they are beginning to consolidate power even more over time. So the governors, there were only about 57% of them were dynastic in 2004. They're now 80% dynastic at this point. Only 2 are left out of the 81 governors who are not from fat dynasties, right? Vice governors, the same. It started with 54%, went up. Mayors are the same. It started with 40%, it went up to over 50%, and so on and so forth. The tendency is to crowd out alternative leaders, to crowd out non-dynasties, and the signal to reformists, the signal to alternative leaders is to form your own dynasty if you want to stay in power. So they quickly turn into the monsters that they wanted to replace. So this is the life cycle of good people put in a bad system who turn bad eventually. And again, Dinjala is sort of the expert here, and I won't spend too much time elaborating on the dynamics of that. This is just one example. Since I'm an economist, you would expect me to correlate governance with poverty reduction, development, and so on. So this is just one picture of one province. So I spared us the picture of the governor's family here in the interest of sensitivity. In 2004, this particular governor had 3 family members in office. In 2019, he has 8 family members at that point. And in the meantime, poverty is increasing in that province, as you can see on the right-hand side of this slide, from about 40.7%, let me see here, to 82.5% at the 2018 period. So you can see this kind of a situation for many provinces, and we have the slides for all provinces in the country for this 2004 to 2018 period. So for those interested, just write to us in Ateneo Policy Center and we can share with you what your province looks like in this country. We also have a website for young people where we actually share the data so that they can track what their province looks like, where they live. See here. So the economic concentration, I mentioned this very, very quickly, and I won't really elaborate on this that much in the interest of time. But the third form of inequality, which actually causes, I think, in a big way, the lack of upward mobility in our country, and the link is the lack of decent job creation, is because of the crony capitalism that exists in part of our economic sectors. Not all, but certainly parts are still relatively impacted by crony capitalist behavior. And one of the ways to cure this, as Professor Carlos mentioned, is also by opening up, by changing the systems, improving regulations, all those institutional reforms which we have been trying to build painstakingly for the last 30 years, but in a very nonlinear 3 steps forward, 2 steps backward kind of way. And I just need to mention Manila Water, the decision on its case, the anti-oligarch rhetoric of some politicians, the anti-foreign direct investment rhetoric of some politicians, and so on and so forth. And you can get a sense that basically it's connections that is driving some of the investment decisions rather than competition and competitiveness. Now, if you have that kind of a system, then don't be surprised there's not enough decent jobs. Don't be surprised that countries like Vietnam and Indonesia take the foreign investments away from us, even though on paper, we have stronger competitiveness in our young people compared to these countries. So I will end with my main message, which is hopefully positive and hopeful, which is how do we change these things? And I slightly disagree with Professor Clarita Carlos. I agree with many things with her, but on this point where she says charter change and constitutional reform is the only way to go forward, I think there are still some reforms we can pursue short of constitutional reforms. I am sympathetic to constitutional reforms if you actually have the right reformists in place. With the wrong people, you can actually get even worse outcomes with that kind of a whole of system reform, which is why I'm quite cautious. And I hope Prof. Claire actually appreciates my cautious view on this as an economist. Well, first of all, I would argue there are 3 main areas One is the inclusive society. We have to build our social protection systems. PhilHealth has been shown to be weak, badly governed, tainted with corruption, and definitely not funded enough to withstand the kinds of shocks that we are seeing right now, including the still present risk of the pandemic. Not sure what the present financial situation of PhilHealth is, but we need to fix it before we grow old. And we will start growing old by 2040 to 2045, according to UN population projections. We can afford a little bit of these shocks and adjustments right now because we're young. But when we're already up there and there are more old people than young Filipinos, that's not the time when you look at a place like PhilHealth Social Insurance, and that's when you start to fix it. That's when it's going to be very, very difficult. Upward social mobility is the other issue here. Without decent job creation in our territory, in our economy, it's going to be very, very difficult to imagine our middle class being satisfied with the type of economic trajectory that we are pursuing. We are enjoying fast growth, at least before the pandemic, but this growth has never really satisfied the growing ambitions of our middle class. We have managed to reduce poverty very, very slowly, and that's obviously a good thing. But the challenge now for the country is not just reducing poverty. It's actually satisfying the ambition of our growing middle class. And the growing middle class is actually what is driving many, many election results from 2016 onwards, as Dean July will probably explain in his presentation. Inclusive democracy, so I'm an outspoken sort of advocate of reforms here, regulate the dynasties, build the political parties. So I very much agree with Professor Clarita Carlos there. I would think you need to do this before pursuing a charter change, before you pursue constitutional reforms. Fix the leaders first. Make sure that we have the right people that we're going to turn such a sensitive and important reform agenda to. If we turn this over to the same dynasties and the same crony capitalists we are already seeing benefiting from the present system, then I don't think we should be surprised that it's going to be a farce, which is what it became in the last 6 years. We thought, Sen Nene and I thought, that this was actually a real federalist decentralization reform. It was hijacked by Congress. And where is Congress at right now? 80% fat dynastic. The third point is inclusive economy. And again, I'm just going to briefly mention, we need to level the playing field, increase competitiveness, improve competition. All the things we've done so far for the economic side are great, but we need to focus now on inclusiveness. We cannot continue to just focus on growth. Growth without it benefiting larger parts of the country, creating new growth engines for the country other than Calabarzon, other than Cebu, other than Metro Manila. That is what we need to pursue now for greater inclusive growth for the country and more stability for our middle class, who will now begin to influence in a big way, if it hasn't already, our political landscape moving forward. Thank you so much, Robbie and colleagues, for the chance to share these views. I hope I didn't run over time too much.
Maraming salamat, Ron, and Dr. July Tihanki. I hope you got all the prompts from Ron. Let's turn over to you. Let's go from Ateneo to LaSalle. Dr. Tihanki, of course, is full professor, research fellow for political science and international studies at De La Salle University.
Thank you, Robbie. I can't start my video. Can you please? It says that the host has stopped my video. So can you please fix?
You can try now, Dr. Tihanki.
There you go. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the organizers of this forum, but first I have to share my screen. Okay. So I would like to thank the organizers of this forum, the Georgetown Club of the Philippines, Harvard Kennedy School Alumni Association, Rotary Club Port Bonifacio Global City, Asia Society, Tumo Podcast, and Radio-Katipunan for inviting me to share my thoughts on the 2022 presidential election. So the election campaign is heating up as hot as this year's summer, and I would like to frame the upcoming election from the broader perspective of political time. Thus, I would like to ask the question, are we now witnessing the twilight of the EDSA Republic? So consider the following. Despite the controversial actions and pronouncements, despite the EJ case and the war on drugs, despite the longest and strictest pandemic lockdown and its problematic implementation, despite allegations about whip of corruption in the Parmali investigation, outgoing President Duterte remains popular. Why? Despite being ousted from power and relegated to the political fringe for more than 3 decades, the Marcos dynasty is making a historic political comeback. Despite losing the vice presidential race and the subsequent electoral protests, the son and namesake of the late dictator Ferdinand Marcos, Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr., has emerged as an early front runner. Again, we ask the question, why? And lastly, BBM's candidacy triggered the decision of Vice President Leni Robredo to finally plunge into the presidential derby. She has taken up the mantle of the EDSA forces, but abandoned the color that symbolized the EDSA People Power Revolution. Recently, there seems to be a groundswell of support for her candidacy, but her numbers have not gone up yet. Why? So these are the questions that I would like to attempt to answer, but I would like to look at it from the perspective of the Philippine presidency as an institution in our political system. The Philippine presidency is the most durable and the oldest in Asia. And the kind of presidentialism that we have, that we patterned after the American model, tends to personalize and concentrate too much power in the presidency. Now, a presidency can either be a prequel or a sequel to a political regime. From the perspective of political time, or what we call political history, presidential performance is not based simply on the presidential style, no? Or the personal qualities of a president. We can look at the presidency as a sequencing of presidencies within different political regimes. And political regime can be understood as a coalition of strategic interests within a particular institutional context framed by a political narrative. Hence, instead of looking at our presidents, from the time of Aguinaldo to Duterte from a chronological perspective, let's chop it up into different regimes and assume that each presidency is either an affiliate or someone who is opposed to the existing regime. And that president can either emerge within that presidency when that regime is either vulnerable or resilient. Hence, if we look at all the presidents that we've had since Quezon, we can say that there are 4 typologies of presidents. The great repudiators, or those who dismantled the old regime and set to establish a new one. So for example, Quezon dismantled, attempted to repudiate and dismantle the colonial regime of the Americans by rallying around the narrative of nationalism and continuing the unfinished revolution of Aguinaldo. Marcos then also repudiated. He ascended within the regime of the post-colonial Third Republic, but he ended that Third Republic by declaring martial law. Manuel Rojas questioned the continuing validity of the nationalist narrative of Quezon and embraced the neo-colonial post-Cold War regime of the Third Republic. And then, of course, Corazon Aquino repudiated Marcos and so on. Now, orthodox innovators are presidents who are affiliated to a strong regime, and their administrations have been marked by a continuation of their political narrative. So we can say that Ramon Magsaysay rescued the Cold War regime, by defeating Quirino, and then Ramos was an orthodox innovator of the EDSA narrative. There are those who are opposed, but they opposed the regime when it was still strong. So Carlos Garcia with his Filipino first policy, and Erap Estrada, our first populist president. And the rest emerged at the time when they were affiliated with the regime, and yet that regime has already been considered weak or vulnerable. So you have Quirino, you have Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, you have Sergio Osmeña, and of course, Marcos with his authoritarian regime, and Noynoy Aquino with the current EDSA regime. Now, historically, the Philippines has gone through 4 regimes covering 5 republics. The nationalist regime of First Republic, Commonwealth, Second Republic, neo-colonial regime, Third Republic, authoritarianism, Fourth Republic, and the liberal reformist regime, also known as the EDSA regime or our current Fifth Republic. Now, using data from the varieties of democracy dataset, the largest data set on democracy right now around the world, we can plot the development and decay, resilience, and vulnerabilities of unconsolidated liberal democracy in the country. It's worth emphasizing that it twice died in our country. First, during the Japanese occupation, and second, during the 14-year Marcos dictatorship. The post-EDSA reformist regime was premised on 2 complementary objectives. First, demarcosification. And second, democratization. The institutional foundations of the reformist regime were laid out in the 1987 Constitution that was drafted to replace the 1973 Constitution. This also signaled a return institutionally to the pre-martial law Third Republic presidential form of government. Now, after 2 peaceful transfer of power in 92 and 98, we were on our way to consolidating our democracy, since most political scientists claim that a consolidated democracy should undergo at least 2 or more peaceful transfer of power through democratic election. So we've had that. We were on our way to having consolidated democracy, but beginning 1998, when we elected our first populist president, we encountered, the country entered into a decade of what is known as legitimation crisis. In the aftermath of EDSA II, the second Aquino presidency was supposed to restore the balance. Of course, that long period of legitimation crisis began with the impeachment trial of Erap Estrada, the EDSA II revolt, and then the contested and allegedly stolen election of 2004 and all the scandals and allegations of corruption under the administration of Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo. Noynoy Aquino was supposed to restore the balance to the EDSA regime, but floundered himself after the midterm with his own series of scandals, no? The pork barrel scandal, his handling of Typhoon Yolanda, and of course, Mama Sapano massacre. This led to a politics of anger that supported the rise of Duterte, Rodrigo Duterte, who then ushered in another period of authoritarian populism. Now, the victory in May 2016 of Rodrigo Duterte reinforced that shift in the political mood of the electorate towards a return to a semblance of strongman rule. In a way, Duterte paved the way for the big political comeback of the Marcos dynasty. Now, authoritarian nostalgia has been silently simmering in the public's political preference since the mid-2000s. So this, what we're seeing right now, did not happen with BBM's campaign, no? Or even Duterte winning 2016. It's been with us since the 2000s. No? Authoritarian nostalgia is a phenomenon in which voters compare life under democracy to either a mythical, growth-oriented authoritarianism in the recent past. No? So this myth being popularized on social media of a golden era and tons of gold. And generation Y and Z are susceptible to accepting this myth because majority of our voters, more than 50%, come from ages 18 to 44. And those in the 44 bracket were only in their elementary grade during EDSA DOS. So more than 50% of our electorate have no clear recollection or even knowledge of what happened during the Marcos era.
Dr.
And then for
Tihanki,
some, yes,
Dr. Tihanki, just a gentle prompt. I'll give you another 2 minutes to wrap up.
yes, I'm down to my 2 slides. Okay, so another manifestation of authoritarian nostalgia is looking at our rich neighbors and trying to emulate the authoritarian neighbors in the region, for example, Singapore. So as early as 2005, the Asian Barometer survey reported that 41.5%, or a little less than most respondents, agreed to a strongman rule, or a majority of 61.5% agreed to some form of authoritarian. Now, this relates to what Adele Webb identified as democratic ambivalence in the Filipino middle class politics, such that we prefer democracy, but our middle class also believe that there's too much democracy and that there's a need for our countrymen or our kababayan to be disciplined, the so-called pasaway narrative. So, just to end this, 4 scenarios in the coming election, given the survey results and given this broad historical view of the upcoming election. First, if Marcos maintains his lead in the survey, he will cruise to victory on election day. In 3 out of 5 elections in the post-Marcos era, the survey leader eventually won. So, if nothing happens between now and the eve of election, Marcos, history is on the side of Marcos. Second, if Vice President Leni Robredo can close the gap, he can replicate the come from behind victory of GMA in 2004 or even Rodrigo Duterte in 2016. And then third, the endorsement of President Duterte can still be a big factor. Fourth, it might take an impossible but not improbable scenario in which some or if not all the other spoiler candidates will gravitate around the strongest candidate next to the BBM Sara tandem. So we will see a lot of negotiations and a lot of movement between now and election day. In ending, no, why is BBM leading the pack? 4 factors based on what I've presented. First is democratic regression. It's our collective failure to consolidate democracy and push for political reforms. What Dean Mendoza just and Professor Carlos just explained to us, we have failed to dismantle patronage democracy. Then, the tumultuous past 6 years have seen the rise of authoritarian populism with its state-sponsored violence, EJKs, drug war, red tagging, disinformation, misinformation, and trolling. And third, EDSA fatigue, the reliance of those belonging to the EDSA regime coalition, no, their reliance on moral politics, no, and elitism have resulted in the weakening of the EDSA narrative and the rise of the anti-EDSA coalition, or those who were marginalized by EDSA. No? So I need not elaborate on that. We know who they are. And lastly, authoritarian nostalgia, or the absence of transitional justice after EDSA, led to some of the vestiges of authoritarianism, the institutions and the agents of authoritarianism being integrated in the post-EDSA system, and of course, the democratic ambivalence of the middle class. And as one of the pro-Marcos intellectuals have asked or have noted, they never left. So the Marcos have always been with us. The Marcos have always been with us. So with that, thank you very much. I'm sorry for extending the time. So thank you very much for your kind attention.
That's fine, and thank you for all the insights, Dr. Tihanki. If you're joining us via Facebook, you can please leave your questions in the comment box. Our moderators will try to get that and bring over your questions here. If you're joining us via Zoom, you can leave your questions direct in the chat or the Q&A box, and we'll try to get to that later. Let's turn now to Dr. Nicole Curato. She's a professor of political sociology at the Center for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance at the University of Canberra. Dr. Curato.
Thank you, Robbie, and good afternoon, everyone. And thank you to the organizers of this event. It's a great pleasure to be able to share my thoughts about what's at stake in the 2022 elections. So my colleagues already answered this question from a structural perspective. So as the sociologist in the room or the sociologist in the screen, I want to examine the micro-political dimensions of this question, or the stakes of the elections from the everyday micro-political experiences of ordinary people. So I have 3 points to address this question, and the ideas that I will put forward are based on an ongoing study funded by the Norwegian Research Council about the popularity of presidential candidate presidential candidate Bongbong Marcos and President Rodrigo Duterte. So in a way, this study has been going on since 2014, when I first went to Tacloban to do ethnographic research about democratic innovations in post-disaster contexts. So in 2019, I published a book with Oxford University Press entitled Democracy in a Time of Misery. And a chapter in that book actually examines how disaster-affected communities, so this is post-Yolanda Tacloban, one chapter in the book examines how disaster-affected communities mobilize their support to then Mayor Rodrigo Duterte's presidential campaign. And of course, since my field site is Tacloban, the Marcos Romualdez narrative has been very prominent in my research. So to me, the incredible popularity of Marcos Jr. is really not surprising. I've attended grand rallies in the Tacloban Astrodome for years. I've attended these grand rallies with the Marcoses and the Romualdezes present, and my key informants were with me, and together we experienced the electrifying effect of the Marcos and Romualdez plans to their constituents. So why is that? So this brings me to my first point, and this is what's at stake in our election. And what's at stake in our elections is, I think, our information ecosystem. And now there's been a lot said about the role of disinformation and troll armies in shaping public preferences and discourses. And it's been argued and proven by tech platforms that the Marcos campaign is the main beneficiary of these operations, which is not to say the Marcos campaign is the only one doing it. But I think it's also important not to fall in the trap of giving moral equivalence and say, well, everyone's using trolls, everyone's at fault equally. I think it's important to signal who disproportionately benefits from these troll operations. But I also think it's important to broaden this conversation, because my long engagement with Marcos supporters in Tacloban, what I realized is that the issue is not always and necessarily about disinformation, but the lack of information. So all over the Philippines, we notice the decline or co-optation of local journalism. There are a lot of news deserts in the country. And in the case of Tacloban, many, though not all, of my respondents think that Marcos Jr. is the only option in 2022, because who else is running? What do they know about that? Who is Vice President Leni Robredo? What has she done? So I think my point here is that because of the vacuum of information, it is Facebook pages, fan groups, community pages, influencers, YouTube channels that perform the role of the journalists in the media. So I think what's at stake in the elections is not just disinformation, but to build on Professor Mendoza's presentation, what's at stake is inequality. It's the inequality in access to information, or data poverty, which compromise our capacity for deliberation and democratic decision-making. So in other words, how can we make intelligent decisions if the information ecosystem does not give us a chance to make intelligent decisions to begin with? So that is the first point. My second point is about political polarization. I think this is also at stake in the aftermath of the elections. I hesitate to say that the Philippines is a deeply polarized and deeply divided society if our idea of polarization is that there are only two main camps with wildly different beliefs. I think if we look at surveys, we can actually get the impression that what we have is a huge majority that is satisfied with President Duterte and a majority that supports Marcos Jr. And what we have is a small but vocal opposition that energetically problematizes the popularity of Duterte and Marcos and holds the space for dissent and contestation. I also think that the depth of difference is more imagined than real, and it's heightened by how conflict unfolds on social media. So again, for the past few months, I've been revisiting my field notes in Tacloban. And actually, now that I observe my respondents from disadvantaged backgrounds, many of them actually are not fanatical supporters of the Romualdezes and the Marcoses. As I've mentioned, they like them because they hear about only these people. They like them because they only hear about them. So their information ecosystem is quite limited. But more than this, I think many of my respondents are also creative political actors. So for example, I have known one respondent, she calls herself a diehard Marcos supporter. She likes Imelda Marcos because she is from Leyte, and my respondent feels proud that Leyte can tell the story of this woman na umangat sa buhay and built a beautiful bridge connecting Samar and Leyte and hosted fiestas for them when the Marcoses were in power. When I asked her if she's open to consider other candidates this 2022, she said, kahit sino, basta bigyan nila ako ng pagkakataon maging leader. And by leader, she means being in charge of the campaign being in charge to campaign and deliver votes from particular barangays. So I will cross-reference this observation to Professor Tihanki's new book on patronage system in the Philippines. Now, going back to that case study, I refuse to actually call her a hakot, or in her case, manghahakot. She's in charge. She wants to be in charge of a certain barangay to deliver votes for whoever is running for office. I don't want to dismiss her as an unscrupulous political actor, because I think what can be drawn from her experience is her openness to be part of a political campaign that has clear benefits for her family's well-being. She knows that she has some capital. She knows she has a social network. She knows she has the skills, and she is ready to do political work, just like advertising companies and creative industries that are ready to use their network and their skills to build a politician's campaign. So I guess just to tidy up the point, I think what's at stake in these elections is our capacity to build bridges and create opportunities to build plausible political projects with intersectional alliances instead of tagging or categorizing Filipinos in artificial categories. The case study I mentioned is a woman who considers herself a diehard Marcos supporter, but is also willing to be convinced by other candidates if they respect her as a political actor and convince her to join their campaign. So I think our differences are not as hardened as we usually think, especially if the only politics that we see is the politics on social media. Finally, it may be stating the obvious, and Professor Carlos already alluded to this. I want to emphasize that what's at stake in these elections, I think, is the peaceful transfer of power. I don't want to be alarmist. I want to be responsible when I say this, but I do worry that there are many indications from both the Marcos and opposition camps that massive electoral fraud will happen in May, and therefore the results of the election will be illegitimate. So my basis for saying this is a qualitative social media monitoring that we're doing of election-related disinformation, and particularly monitoring posts that cast doubt on electoral integrity. So some question the integrity of ballot printing. Others say that if Marcos doesn't win, it's because the US interfered in the elections. Marcos Jr. already claimed that he was cheated in 2016. I've gathered posts on social media that say that surveys are rigged and that the COMELEC is unreliable and that the only reason Vice President Robredo will lose is because of electoral fraud. And I think this is a cause of concern. Elections are important because they facilitate a peaceful transfer of power. But that only happens when the results are credible. And I think independent election monitors are crucial in this election, given the intensity of suspicion about the outcomes of elections. And I really hope I'm wrong, because I couldn't be happier if the ending of this election, regardless who wins, if the ending results to a peaceful transfer of power. So I will end my comments there. Robbie, back to you.
Maraming salamat. You could end it there, Nicole, but I won't let you off the hook. I'll keep you for my first question, because I do want to take it from the lens of society first, and not necessarily from the lens of politics. You talked about political polarization. Everybody did. But the reality is that's how elections are in the Philippines, di ba? As in many sites, elections are almost by definition divisive for a moment in time, and it doesn't quickly heal. But I suspect that this particular elections, because the polarization has become very, very explicit, and in fact very brazen, spelled out for everyone, di ba? That this is against Dissente politics. This is about, as Dr. Tihanki said, could this be the waning of the EDSA republic, and so on. Manolo Quezon, I saw in one article, framed it as again reformists versus populists over the past decades. And so we're heading into after May. Let's assume everything on good faith. Let's assume everything is clean. Everybody accepts it's credible. It's credible elections, and your worst fears do not come to pass. But then now we come with our normal fears, which is first thing people inherit, the leaders, this government inherits, is a divided country still. Talk about that society that the new government, whoever wins, will be inheriting and will have to lead. And what are the divisions in that society? What are the lines of division that have to be addressed from the easiest to the most difficult?
I think what's peculiar about this election is we don't have a leader who is, or we don't have a candidate who is brazenly populist, because that's how divisions are actually institutionalized. We had President Duterte, who had this populist division of virtuous Filipinos versus drug addicts, right? So in this entire regime, his regime just excluded the rights of drug addicts because that is the way he views society. I don't think any of our candidates created that division. In fact, if you look at presidential candidate Marcos, it's about unity, right? Everyone is welcome. Human rights lawyers, people with cases of graft, everybody's welcome. So I think that kind of appeal to unity in a way has an anti-populist spin, that everybody is welcome. But then I also draw inspiration from my respondents, because I feel like the conversations we're having about the academic debates on the populist versus the reformist, a language that I use myself in my academic work, does not really resonate when you talk to communities who are just trying to get by and make a living. For them, they will support a president who will help them. To them, they will support a president who will be there when a disaster hits, right? So I think the challenge of healing and building bridges is more the task of people who are in the intelligentsia, in the social media fights, and how we can find common ground. I don't think the Philippines is like the United States, that is polarized to the point that people who go to Whole Foods are Democrats and people who don't go to Whole Foods are Republicans. I don't think that encroaches on our social space. And I think the final answer is I draw inspiration from the work of, he's a political philosopher, Robert Delis, and he actually argues about the importance of creating social spaces that are ring-fenced against politics. It sounds counterintuitive, right? Like for people in the room, we study politics in very different ways, but also there is a recognition that we can hold stability as a nation if we also build social spaces where we can see each other as humans, not just as people with political preferences. So yeah, I think the rebuilding will happen on the social dimension and not just on the political dimension.
Okay. But Ron and Dr. Tehanki, let me bring you back. If you could turn on your cameras for everyone to see. And this is a question for everyone. But if that's true, and let's put it this way. Ang problema ng mga Pilipino is still sa sikmura nila. Diba? Even after the election, I agree. We're not ideologues. A big part of the reason also why the political party system is really so weak and practically non-existent. Pero kung sa sikmura pa rin tayo mag-uumpisa, isn't that basically starting from the same grounds by which we will still be perpetuating the same flawed political patronage system, and will still be essentially be functioning with the same dynamics that feed off the same desperation of our people. So that leads us off on the wrong foot yet again.
Yeah, we are where we are because of the failure of the political class, the political class in the post-EDSA period to address the most important aspect of all, which is what Dean Ron mentioned in his presentation, which is inclusiveness, and every administration upon ascending to power would focus on the economic aspect, but they usually run out of time in tackling the most important political reforms. They managed to work on a couple of social reforms, but not completely. And for as long as we haven't really addressed the very structural nature of our political system and our economic system and address the problem of inequality, the lack of actual polarization. In fact, you mentioned polarization. From a classical political science perspective, In fact, that's the problem. We actually lack the proper polarization based on actual socio-political privileges. Our polarization is based on high-stakes personality patronage-based politics.
Ron, you have a
Yeah, just to add that I'm a big supporter of focusing on political reforms at this point, even though I'm an economist. My general observation based on the research of the political scientists and the research of the economists and the research of Nicole and other social scientists is we have over-focused on liberalizing the economy, and it has produced some good things, but we have not liberalized our political system. It is still in the clutches of these clans. And if we don't liberalize that political system so that you at least give some further legitimacy to that system, then
so what's a simple mechanism?
there's three at least that I learned from Dean July. So I just basically support his reform agenda as well. It's dynasty regulation, political party reform, and campaign finance reform. At the very least, these three things, and then you go with the next set, which has to do with social safety nets. Because if you don't have a strong middle class that can stand on its own, they go back to the patrons, in cycles with shocks. So that's another set. All of our social safety nets we need to fix, make them inclusive, make them see that it's not just the poor we need to protect at this point. There's a big middle class with demands for stability, and they're not getting it.
Okay. We have a question here from an anonymous attendee. It says, what about education? Isn't quality education also an important element in breaking the trap through inclusion? Education needs to outpace the speed of misinformation and emotionally charged debates in social media. Quality education might also suffer considering malnutrition is a big issue in the Philippines. Your thoughts?
I mean,
Well,
of course, I will not. Sorry, go ahead, Dean.
Sige, Nicole, please.
No, I'll just say I don't disagree. Obviously, education is important, but I think we also need to take the next step. What happens after the students graduate? So if they end up with low-paying, precarious jobs, how can we further upskill our workforce to contribute to the economy, right? So parang in the Philippines, there's always this huge illusion that education is what's responsible for social mobility, but we also have to close the gap in terms of, well, what jobs do we get after people graduate from either high school or university?
And also, I might just want to volunteer here and add, speaking of not just what the next government will inherit, but what the next governments, actually, the government to be elected in 2028, 10 years from now, they will be inheriting a workforce that basically has a cohort of grade schoolers now who were basically stunted for 2.5 years in their most foundational and most basic education. And not to mention, as our anonymous commenter pointed out, not only stunted mentally, but even stunted physically for having been deprived of public feeding programs in public schools. And these are at their formative and foundational. But again, Dr. Tihanki and Ron, I just want to prompt this also. Every time somebody asks about education, one is everybody agrees we need that. Personally, my problem with it is, yeah, but education, tagal-tagal pa bago kumagat yung impact niyan. Di ba?
Yeah.
Is there any way to answer that at the same time, throw us a bone na we can do something that can pay off in 3 years?
Yeah, di ba panahon pa ni Jose Rizal, di ba? Kaya nga hindi siya for armed in rebellion against the Spanish colonizer namin. Sabi niya kailangan ng edukasyon, di ba? So panahon pa ni Rizal yan ang issue. No? Pero again, aside from the fact na kung may education ka man, ano man ang trabahong makukuha mo after, no? Ako babalikan ko pa yung bago pag-graduate, no? Kasi di ba sa social science, no, and I'm sure Ron and Nicole would agree, no, there's such a thing as unintended consequences, no. So all the educational reforms in the post-ed's period, no, the unintended consequences is removing subjects on history, social science, humanities, no? The great K-12 reform that was supposed to elevate our graduates, no? Nag-produce nga tayong graduates pero kulang naman ang kaalaman sa kapanahunan ng martial law at kay Marcos, no? Kulang naman sa critical thinking na pwedeng ituro ng philosophy at humanities. Kulang sa pag-appreciate sa debate at pagrespeto sa kakaibang pag-iisip. So, yun yung nangyari, no? Nagkaroon tayo ng unintended consequence itong mga educational reforms. Kaya kung babalikan natin itong mga reformang to, kailangan tutukan din natin itong mga issue na ito. Kaya yung sinasabi kong 50% ng ating botante from 18 to 44, ang nalalaman lang nila sa panahon ni Marcos gumawa ng tulay, di ba? At kinalaban ng mga komunista. So, di ba? So, and then we're surprised kung bakit sikat sila ngayon, di ba?
Ron, let me ask something about you mentioned Mandanas, no? The Mandanas ruling. And every time it's brought up, Dr. July knows this because we talked about it also on the chiefs. One question that always comes up is capacity at the local level. You did mention, I mean, this is going to be a lot of money flowing. Never mind the initial crunch that everybody will be feeling once this gets out of the gate next year, given that their budget for next year was based on pre-pandemic budgets and era. But the reality is, once this is downloaded, not only the money but also the certain authorities, what is the capacity of civil society, of private sector, and of citizens to actually understand and to monitor what is going to take place at the local levels? I'll throw in, by the way, I mean, part of the capacity that we're wondering about is capacity even of media, capacity of NGOs in far-flung areas.
Yes, indeed, it's an ecosystem, and that's the best way to describe what we need to build for the good governance result that we want. It's not just any one player. In fact, I would argue that with a government that actually wants to be more transparent and wants to be held accountable, with systems with that bias, you'll actually get the good kind of engagement, the empowering kind of engagement that we really aspire for. And we saw a little bit of this in the previous administration when they tried to, in the words of the reformists then, build the muscle of civil society and the citizens to better understand the people's budget. That's what they called it, right? Now, it's a highly technical document. It's a lot of numbers on where money is spent. And if you don't really want it to be widely understood, that's an easy task. You just don't need to do anything. And so few people will appreciate what you can do with the budget. So I think that's really the challenge right now. For those areas with better governance, the Mandanas ruling will probably be a boon and result in even better development prospects. But for those areas that are already being left behind, unfortunately, I think they will be further left behind even with the Mandanas transfer. Robbie, you're on mute.
Oh, sorry. I thought Dr. Tihanki was. I was just trying to prompt Dr. Tihanki. Akala ko Dr. Tihanki?
Well, yeah. Some of our local chief executives are expecting the Mandanas ruling to be a manna from heaven. But what they fail to realize that it might result in added responsibilities that they do not have the capacity to handle. No? So it's a repeat of the flow of the 1991 local government code all over again. No? So hindi naman lahat yan pantay na kayang mag-absorb nitong funding na ito at may to na responsibility at trabaho na baka naman hindi nila kaya. So it's a question also of absorptive capacity. So if we will recall, that happened exactly to health devolution, di ba? So dinevolve yung health functions sa local governments na wala namang kakayanan. So nakita rin natin yan na isa sa mga naging problema nitong pandemic. So kailangan talagang pag-isipan ng mabuti kung paano itong Mandanas ruling ay mas makakatulong sa mas totoong decentralization na empowering. Hindi, at saka isa pang problema dyan, baka gamitin na naman to for patronage democracy na tinatawag ko. By the way, libro ko yung kaya ko madalas sinasabi.
Feel free to post your book and where to access it in the chat section so everybody will know. That goes for everybody. And I want to follow through on Dr. Tihanki's could this be the end of the EDSA Republic? And inevitably, we'll have to, like I said, we're trying to look at Philippine society way past May. And we're trying to be agnostic as to whoever might win. But inevitably, I almost inevitably, I'd like to think and I'd like to invoke, I'd like to use the lens of the Lenny campaign as well for this. Because when they shift, when they abandon yellow, basically, when they abandon the color yellow, there's an acknowledgement there, right, of something that will not sell. There is an acknowledgement there of something that, I'll be blunt in a way that many people do not want to say it or hear it. There's something damaged there, whether fair or unfair. But you take it from that lens. What is the thinking by politicians and political scientists essentially making this marketing decision? Let's go with pink. Iwan natin ng yellow. Not to speak for the campaign, but to speak for what they might be hearing and feeling with people on the ground.
Well, from a political marketing perspective, it's plain and simple rebranding, and even repositioning. Right? So BBM rebranded himself and his message. And it's the irony of all ironies in this year's election that the most divisive political brand has appropriated the message of unity and hope. And it's working, and it's resonating. So you have to give it to their team for doing that, for successfully rebranding and repositioning their candidate. Now, the Lenny campaign has also attempted to do the same, but the problem is even the changing of color. Why pink? From yellow to pink, why pink? Tapos, and then it's you change the brand, but you did not change the narrative. It's still, if you look at the narrative of the Lenny campaign, it still relies largely on what our friend Wataru Kosaka termed as moral politics. So it's still vote for us because we're good. Mabuting tao kami, aangat ang buhay dahil sa matinong gobyerno. So it's no different from Matuwid na Daan, which was tarnished from within because of the DAP pork barrel scandal, and of course the onslaught of attacks by the DDS. So it's a damaged brand, sad to say. So yun ang yun ang.
But I guess let me rephrase. But I guess that's my question. I mean, Nicole and Dr. Rod, given yon, parang of course really the brutal trolling by not just by the DDS but by the Duterte administration itself obviously damaged it. But on the other side of it is, my question is, when they make that decision outside of the damage and the tainting that was deliberate, what is the pink campaign acknowledging about yellow? What will they acknowledge about, or what should they acknowledge about yellow. Other than saying na ano, kasi that's the other side of it, di ba? If they say na, no, damaged lang yan dahil tinotroll kami, it's the same as saying na, hindi, rebranding lang to, we're essentially the same. But they're also very, very quick to say that, no, we are not the same. So if you take it from that perspective, what is that side of the thinking actually trying to acknowledge without grudgingly admitting it, that there is something that they needed to acknowledge about how yellow politics is perceived?
I think when we listen to the vice president and her daughters, actually, there is a strong emphasis on listening to people who do not share the same view. Sobrang ang lakas ng call to action, especially of the grounded house-to-house campaign coming from the top. I mean, the Robredos themselves, calling their supporters to engage with people who are not like them. And I think that is the difference in terms of the origins of the campaign. The Aquino campaign presupposed that they already have a shot at winning by virtue of the president's son. Parang it's destiny. Cory Aquino died, there was support, and then it's destiny. That was part of the story. But for the Robredo campaign, there was no such story. So there is a recognition that for them to grow the movement, they need to be able to reach out to people who are not like them. And I think once there was a question in the Q&A in terms of, is the Robredo campaign already a movement? My answer is it remains to be seen. Rallies are fantastic. They are exhilarating. They affirm that you are not alone in believing in the candidate. They affirm that you are supported by like-minded people. They affirm that the campaign is represented by people who have different forms of marginalities, poor people, LGBT, students, senior citizens. It's fun and it's exhilarating. But this is the physical embodiment of an echo chamber, right? Obviously, pupunta ka sa rally kasi gusto mo yung mga kasama mo sa rally. And I think this is what's very exciting about the Robredo campaign. If the house-to-house movement can actually shift the outcome of the elections, and most importantly, if Vice President Robredo does win to become president, what happens to that movement? How will people take part in political participation? So I am from the EDSA DOS generation. My first rally was the Era of Ouster rally. And I can honestly say, tinamad yung generation ko. After that rally, we felt so politically effective. Political efficacy. Yeah, we had a huge sense of political efficacy. Pero after that, wala na, okay na. We just, live our lives. So I think this is a very critical moment on how the Robredo campaign can translate the emerging movement to something more sustainable and build institutions for political participation. Because after all, this is the NAGA model, right? The participatory democracy model of NAGA that has been really the stellar case study in all MBAs and public administration modules around the world. It's the NAGA case study of political participation. So what does a People's Council look like on the national level if Robredo becomes president? So I think that is my main curiosity in terms of, can her supporters transform to become a movement?
Okay. So the other side of it, and unfortunately, Dr. Clarita Carlos is no longer here. But I'll throw this to you, Ron, and anybody else. When you listen very hard, and I admit, a lot of people, I think I'm speaking for a lot of people, when we heard it from Dr. Carlos in her conversation with Bongbong Marcos, a lot of people recoiled at the term. It was somewhat reassuring to hear her framing her thoughts about what this country needs in terms of political will, in terms of a strong leader. But essentially, what is she saying when she says that I'd prefer that we have a Machiavellian?
Is that directed at me, Robbie?
Yeah, to anyone. No,
I get the tougher question.
No. I asked this also because kanina I was having a conversation. I'll be honest. Kanina I was having a conversation with Ching Jorge of Youth Left, and I said, my first instinct here is, of course, this is gonna go viral. She has a lot of followers now. It's very popular. One is there's a certain level of inoculation and normalization that now comes with the word. But my other concern is social media. I saw a lot of tweets saying, "Uy, my new word of the day ako." Di ba? I have another highfalutin thing to start saying, and so on. And I'm thinking, one moment and one virality, and I'm thinking, how many years to undo, or at least to try to give the nuance and the education just on that one word. So I'm trying to listen very hard. I'm hoping you're gonna, but listening very hard, what is not just Dr. Carlos, but to be fair, take it away from her. What is Bongbong Marcos also saying? When he says, "Oh, matagal ko nang pinag-aaralan niya si Machiavelli."
Yeah. Well, I think actually si Dean July began to answer this in his presentation. There is my interpretation of it, and again, I defer to Dean July on the political science aspect of this. But from an economic perspective, if you're looking at a middle class that is disgruntled, not happy with the lack of inclusiveness, not happy with poverty reduction that is slow, growth that is high but is unequal in their results. They want, big changes, right? And unfortunately, our inability to give that demand an outlet so that they could be heard, they could be reflected in policy, economic policies, very importantly, they most likely turn to populists to try and shake up the tree and get what they want. And so it's not so surprising to me that the populist wave, which is not yet over in our country, is getting a lot of support not from the poor necessarily, but from the low-income middle class. Now, obviously, for those of us who have read Machiavelli and who understand what Machiavellian means, it is unscrupulous ruthlessness. Basically, this is the Webster's dictionary definition, right? And you don't want, and it includes hypocrisy, not telling the truth, being really a bad leader, right? But it also, I guess, evokes a certain level of sort of a maverick approach at governance that will shake up the tree, not take the status quo as a given. At least I'm trying to give that what might be an appealing spin to it, right? And I'd like to think that when Professor Claire actually describes Machiavelli, that's what she means. But in fact, the real and true interpretation of Machiavellian is actually quite dark and is linked to authoritarianism. So one hopes that's not really what we're building towards. But I think I can understand a little bit why some people actually gravitate to such a maverick way.
Yeah, but not just people gravitating to it, or not just people even finding it fashionable to be contrarian and say, "Oh." But when Bongbong Marcos himself basically does not reject it, di ba? And that it's asked of him. I believe he knows what it means, politically, structurally, and even the Webster definition. I believe he knows what it means.
Right.
But when he doesn't reject it, he doesn't distance himself, knowing all the baggage that comes with the Marcos name, what is he seeing in their own understanding of people, in their own gamble that this is the right answer to that question?
Dijula, you want to take a crack at it?
Oh, yeah. Kasi I'm so sure, Professor Carlos, who was also my professor at UP when I took my master's there, she knows her Machiavelli, Pero I doubt if Bongbong Marcos read Machiavelli and really understood what it was all about. Kasi alam natin what the prince was all about. It was a personal
but ito nga yung point. Sorry, July. Sorry, July. I'm coming from the perspective that I'm assuming that he does know. Diba? I'm giving him the benefit of doubt that he understands, even at the most basic level, that it's amoral politics, it's fascist, and so on. The end justifies the means and all of that. I'm assuming that he did understand what the question was, and he knew both sides of this of the risk here, and he actually chose to say, "No." Ang point ko lang is, might he be saying that actually Filipinos will find this appealing?
It's an affirmation of where he stands in his political philosophy, and he embraces that, and that is exactly the same philosophy as his father's, If you read Remigio Agpalo, that is exactly what Marcos was all about, right? So the Pangulo regime, So kaya nga ano no, ang sa akin, balikan natin no ang effect niyan sa middle class, no, yung sinasabi ni Ron, no, yung what Adele Webb recently wrote about, chasing freedom, no, the democratic ambivalence of the middle class. The rise of Duterte was not really your classic Arab style populism. It wasn't the poor who supported him. It was the middle class, no. Ang middle class ang nagluklok kay Duterte at sumuporta sa mga karamihan ng mga polisiyan niya, no. So remember, the middle class supported the declaration of martial law. Tayo, Robbie, buhay na tayo mga panahon na yun. So, maalala natin. I don't know about Ron, no? So, alam ko na yung middle class were so happy with the declaration of martial law, at least for the first 3 to 4 years, no? Until problema sa ekonomiya, no? Nang nagbagsakan na yung, lumitaw na yung mga cronies, no? So, and then, the same middle class supported the democratic struggle against the dictatorship that led to EDSA. No? And then, yung sa panahon na nila Ron at ni Nicole, EDSA 2. No? Pero yun nga kung titignan mo lahat ng surveys, ito-track mo, ang taas ng preference natin for democracy, lalong-lalo na yung middle class. Pero sila din yung nagsasabi na minsan sumusobra ang demokrasya, kaya kailangan natin ng strong leader para magdisiplina. It's the same pasaway narrative na nakita natin nung pandemic, no? At sinusuportahan niya ng karamihan sa middle class natin. So, nagre-resonate yung Machiavellian statement ni BBM dito sa mga supporters nito.
I think if I can just react to that, if we observe what kind of a leader he is, based on how he runs his campaign, I think mas contemporary authoritarian yung style. Meaning, my colleague calls it sophisticated authoritarianism. Meaning, siguro hindi siya mag-i-impose ng martial law. Siguro hindi militar yung magpapatakbo ng gobyerno. Pero magkakaroon ng mga rollbacks. Halimbawa, I will not engage with biased media. Sa SMNI lang ako mag-attend na debate. Hindi alam ng press corps kung ano yung schedule ng campaign niya. Gulatan na lang. Hindi siya magpapa-ambush interview. All accusations and calls for accountability will be dismissed. Chismis yan. Paninirang tao lang yan. Right? So, it will not be an in-your-face martial law. There will be a curfew. But these are authoritarian innovations that will constrain spaces for voice and accountability. And I think that's scary because that's the palatable face of martial law. And you can formally appear like you're a democratic state. You can appeal to foreign governments to continue foreign aid. You can appeal for foreign governments to support you because you're formally democratic. There are elections every 6 years. You have midterm elections. But the control is more sleek or slick, right? But I also draw inspiration from the Marcos supporters that we've been interviewing. I've been spending 2 weeks now. My research associate and I have been spending 2 weeks interviewing Marcos supporters every evening. And we interviewed someone yesterday, and he's very much impressed with the infrastructure legacies of Marcos Sr. and President Duterte. And then I asked him, hindi po ba kayo nababother dun sa mga human rights violations? And his line was, kung may umabuso, alam na ng mga tao kung anong gagawin nila. So there is always this threat na parang pag umabuso kayo, mag-e-EDSA kami ulit. Right? So I think in a way, that is precisely the point of democratic ambivalence, that Filipinos are ready to balance democracy with all different ideas and kind of disregard a particular idea if it no longer works for them. Which is not to say it's not scary. I'm just saying that for some supporters, may hangganan siya.
Yeah, Robbie, if I may quickly add to what Nicole said, no, in fact that's the trend not only in the Philippines but around the world. No, if you read How Democracies Die, no, gone are the days of the tanks and military hard authoritarian power grabs. No, what we are seeing is actually soft, light, authoritarianism. No, and we've seen that also with Trump, in the United States. No, and with other populists in Europe and in other parts of the world. No, pero ang dyan kasi yun nga ang makikita natin ang patutunguhan nito, meron din political system known as soft or electoral competitive authoritarianism. No? Yung ibang bansa sa Southeast Asia, karamihan sa kanila actually authoritarian pero may election. Di ba? So baka doon tayo patungo. No?
Okay. we're practically out of time. I just want to give each of our speakers, kung kaya nyo, 30 seconds each for a final statement. And let's go back to the theme of our discussion. What's at stake? And not in terms of this campaign, not in terms of any particular candidate, but what's at stake in terms of what does our society look like from day one of this new government? What's the baseline for the new government as they assume office in the second half of this year? Anyone can start.
Okay,
Well,
I'll start.
Sige.
You? No, actually, I will start because ipi-plagiarize ko lang naman si Prof. Mendoza dito. So I understand this panel discussion has been a love fest. So for people who joined here expecting Bardagulan, I'm sorry. But I remember one interview I did with Prof. Mendoza when we talked about what's at stake with political dynasties if we don't break political dynasties. And his answer to me was, there will not just be poverty, but there will be a poverty of ideas. And I think this is what's at stake in these elections. Parang it's a battle of ideas about it's a battle of ideas about the story we want to tell about the Philippines. It connects the present to the past, but also the future. I was very much confronted by former Commissioner Guanzon's speech that we are also looking at the third generation of the Marcoses being present. So we're not just talking about historical revisionism, Marcos Jr. running, but the future Marcoses having a role in Philippine politics. And the question is this country okay with that? And I think the elections will be very decisive in setting the narrative of the country for the next few decades.
Maybe I'll go next so that Dean July can give the final nice finish. But thank you, Nicole. I would add just in terms of the battle of ideas, but the battle of perceptions and narratives. I mean, you were talking about tainted brand for the Liberal Party, but I mean, how can you say that when we're talking about the ultimately tainted brand of the dictatorship, no? So, if you're going to look at taints for what happened in the last 30 years, they pale in comparison to the tainted brand of the dictatorship. And so it is really a perception setting more than anything else. And even if you concede that we did not hit many of the reforms we wanted in the last 30 years, that's not to say that the dictatorship was better. And so therefore we should go back to it, which is really what the narrative now suggests. So it's really misleading. And I think, if you are fair and if you are transparent, that you tell that, yes, we did not hit all of the reforms. But there's a saying, I think in other countries, only a Trudeau can fail. Only someone who is truthful, transparent, goes for citizens empowerment, all the nice things that Nicole mentioned, that group can fail. But someone that does not set a high bar, that is actually just perception setting, that cannot fail so much, no? So you can always sort of correct the perception again in your favor. So I think in terms of values also, there must be some kind of battle of values happening right now. What kind of a country do you want to end up with? Which is why I am really heartened to see the church and different civil society groups now really active and speaking up more. And I think it will be a different flavor this time around, hopefully enough and in time.
Yes.
Okay, so again, going back to my presentation, again, I'd like to ask the question, are we seeing the twilight of the EDSA Republic? And and I would like to echo what Dean Mendoza said. It's true that EDSA had its flaws, but of course, EDSA also brought us hope. And EDSA was a promise. That promise may not have been completely been delivered, but it doesn't mean that we should go back to a regime that has been far worse than what we have been through in the past 30 years. So the stakes are high, not only for the different presidential candidates, but really for the trajectory of our country, especially with regard to whether we will really try to consolidate our democracy, or we're just going to regress and go back to square one. And again, I belong to that generation that came of age under the Marcos years, and I was part of that generation that joined the democratic struggle to restore our democracy, no matter how flawed. And it is up to the next generation to continue that struggle.
Okay, maraming sa lahat. Dr. Nicole Curato, Dr. Julio Tihanki, and Dr. Ron Mendoza. Maraming salamat po. And let me say also on my behalf, it's been a privilege, always an honor, always enjoyable being with all of you. And I turn over to to our host now. Specifically, I want to bring in Kendrick Go for our final remarks and to close out our program.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Kendrick Go, past president of the Rotary Club of Fort Bonifacio Global City. As we have all heard from our panelists, our country's problems are a result of structural and systemic deficiencies that have been piling up for decades. While it is improbable for any single administration to address all of these issues, this year's elections represent an opportunity to get started on addressing these festering issues in our society. Hopefully, this afternoon has served as a reminder that building a functioning and vibrant Philippines is a continuous work in progress, and we must all do our part by making informed choices this coming year. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day.
So maraming salamat po ulit sa lahat. I guess this is still me on behalf of Bambina and Manila House, Asia Society Philippines. Let me just make sure I'm not missing anyone. The Georgetown University Alumni Association, the Kennedy School of Government Alumni Association, Rotary Club of Fort Bonifacio Global City. Yeah, and I think I mentioned already Asia Society and Manila House. Maraming salamat po sa inyong lahat.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ingat.
Di kailanman mapipigilan pagbuhos ng ulan. Ang buhay sadyang ganyan.
At kaya ng papago-bagong pag-ihip ng hangin. Lahat ay lilipas at magsasalita.
Huwag kang mabahala, huwag mataranta. Hindi kailangan ang mag-alilangan pa.
Isipin mo laging nandito lamang ang aking balikat, sa'yo'y nakaabang.
Asahan mo, hindi ka iiwan sa mundo. Lahat may hangganan, asahan mo. Wala nang atrasan sa iyong bawat hakbang na pupuntahan.
Pangako kailanman, agad akong nandyan.
Sang tawag mo
At tuwing nagdidilim ang langit, di ba't nagpapakita ang buwan? Hanggang mag-umaga na naman.
Tara't hintayin na natin
Sikat ng iyong araw
hanggang sa magliwanag muli ang lahat. Asahan mo, hindi ka iiwan sa mundo. Lahat may hangganan, asahan mo. Wala nang atrasan sa iyong bawat hakbang na pupuntahan.
Pangako kailanman, agad akong nandyan.
Sang tawag mo may hangganan, asahan mo. Wala nang atrasan sa iyong bawat hakbang mapupuntahan. Pangako kailanman, akala kong nandyan, sang tawag mo lang. Sang tawag mo lang.
Mga katipuneros, it's time to level up! Your talk variety program showcasing the best in media and other fields. As we feature the most loved personalities and the best practices of what we truly refer to as Magis. Together with multi-awarded multimedia guru Mr. Noel Ferrer, let's all level up every Fridays from 3 to 6 p.m. here on Radyo Katipunan 87.9 FM.